Anchoring bias is the mind's habit of latching onto the first piece of information it sees, and then never really letting go. Imagine dropping an anchor in the ocean. It sinks, and no matter how far you drift, you're still tethered to that starting point. That's how our thinking works sometimes. We hear a number, a fact, a suggestion, and that first thing sticks. Even if it's random, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it's wrong, that anchor becomes our frame, and everything else gets measured against it. You see this in stores all the time. A jacket is labeled $300, but it's on sale for $150. Now $150 feels like a deal, but maybe the jacket was only worth $100 to begin with. The $300 wasn't the value, it was the anchor. And once the anchor is dropped, we compare, we adjust, but we rarely drift far from where we started. This shows up in negotiations. Someone makes the first offer, high or low, and suddenly, that's the ground both sides are standing on, even if that number was pulled out of thin air. It happens in job interviews too. If you hear a salary range before you apply, your expectations shift, you're anchored. And it even works on things we don't expect, like guessing the age of someone, or estimating how far away a city is. If the first thing you hear is 100 miles, you'll guess close to that. But if you first hear 500 miles, your guess jumps. Even if you're just guessing, our brains are looking for a starting point, and the first number we get feels solid. It gives us certainty, even if it's just pretend. But this bias isn't just about numbers. It can shape opinions too. Let's say you're introduced to someone, and you're told they're really smart. That label sticks. It colors how you see them. You notice their insights. You give them the benefit of the doubt. But if you're told they're kind of arrogant first, you'll see the same behavior through a different lens. The first impression is the anchor, and every thought after that gets pulled in its direction. This is why rumors are so powerful. Once something is said, even if it's corrected later, the first version lingers. It echoes. It's especially powerful in first-time experiences. The first time you try sushi, or hear a new artist, or meet someone from a country you've never visited. Whatever you feel in that moment becomes the baseline. And the next time you're in a similar situation, your mind will compare it to the first one. Was it better? Worse? Similar? But always compared. Anchoring bias makes things sticky, and stickiness isn't always bad. But it means we have to be careful about the firsts we accept as facts. Because sometimes, the anchor isn't something we chose, it's something we were handed. It might be a belief from childhood, a story from the news, a label from someone we trusted. And now we're walking through the world, measuring everything against it, even if it no longer fits. Think about someone who's been told their whole life they're not creative. That idea becomes their anchor. So every time they do something artistic, they dismiss it. They say, this isn't real art, because it doesn't match the label. Anchoring bias doesn't only live in logic, it also lives in identity. Sometimes we anchor ourselves to a version of who we were, at 12, at 25, at 40, and we use that to measure who we are now. Even if we've grown, even if we've changed, the mind wants stability, and anchors offer that. They make decisions easier. They give us a reference point. But if that point is off, everything built around it gets tilted. Imagine trying to hang a painting, but your level tool is crooked. Everything looks straight until you step back. So what do? We can start by noticing the firsts. Notice the first number, the first impression, the first idea. Ask, why do I think this is normal? Was this number chosen by me, or given to me? If I hadn't seen that first, would I still think the same way? Sometimes just asking that helps loosen the anchor. You can even imagine lifting it, like letting go of a weight, and watching the boat drift freely again. Over time we can practice floating a little more freely, letting each idea stand on its own, not just in relation to the one before it. You can train your mind to pause, to say, hold on, let me reset, to step back and look again, as if it's all new. Because sometimes, you only see the bias when you shift the frame. Anchoring bias doesn't mean you're gullible. It just means your brain likes shortcuts, and the first shortcut usually sticks. But when you recognize the anchor, you can lift it, you can drift beyond it, you can make choices from a place of clarity, not just habit. And that's how you grow. Not by judging the bias, but by seeing it, naming it, and gently letting go. The availability heuristic is a shortcut, a mental one. It's our brain trying to figure out how likely something is by asking, How easily can I think of an example? If something comes to mind quickly, the brain assumes it must happen often. It must be common. It must be true. But fast doesn't mean frequent and vivid doesn't mean valid. Imagine this. You hear about a plane crash on the news. It's dramatic. There are interviews, pictures, videos, and for days, you keep thinking about it. So when someone asks, is flying safe? Your brain says no. Because the crash is right there, fresh in your mind. But statistically, flying is one of the safest ways to travel. You're far more likely to get hurt in a car. But you don't see car crashes on the front page. You don't see 10-minute segments with music and slow motion clips. And so, your brain forgets. Because what we remember isn't always what matters most. This happens with fears too. We're more afraid of things that make headlines, shark attacks, terrorism, lightning strikes, and we're less afraid of things that actually harm more people, like heart disease or texting while driving. Why? Because the dramatic stuff sticks. We picture it. We feel it, we remember it, and the quiet, invisible risks, they fade into the background. This is the availability heuristic. Our brain says, if I can think of it fast, it must be important. But sometimes, the brain confuses memorable with meaningful. It happens in parenting. You hear one scary story about a child being kidnapped at a park, and suddenly you're afraid to let your child go outside. Even though the risk is incredibly rare, your brain holds on to the fear, because that story was loud, and fear is sticky. Or in relationships, you might remember the one argument that hurt instead of the 50 quiet days of peace, because pain stands out, and peace just passes by. And so, your memory becomes skewed, not because you're weak, but because your mind is protecting you. It's prioritizing what felt intense over what was statistically normal. It happens with health. You hear about one person your age who got really sick, and now every ache feels like a symptom. Every cough feels heavier, because that one example is playing on a loop in your head. This shows up in news cycles too. When one crime is reported again and again, we start to feel like crime is everywhere, even if the overall rate hasn't changed. Or when we hear 5 stories about job layoffs, we feel like everyone's losing their job, even if unemployment is low. Our brains are building a world based on what they can quickly recall. And that world isn't always accurate. It's like judging the size of the ocean by what's floating on top. This heuristic can even affect your self-perception. If you can easily remember times you've failed, you might believe you're not good enough. Not because that's true, but because the moments of doubt are easier to access. They echo louder. And that echo can drown out your growth, your quiet wins, your resilience. Sometimes you forget how many good choices you made, how many days you showed up, how many times you were kind, because the memory of that one mistake is easier to grab. So how do we deal with it? How do we help our brains see more clearly? We can pause. We can ask ourselves, is this fear based on frequency, or just freshness? Am I reacting to reality, or just to what I remember most? We can look for data, numbers, context. We can remind ourselves that just because we saw it or heard it, doesn't mean it's likely to happen again. We can talk to people with different experiences. Ask, has this happened to you? Or how common is this really? And when we catch ourselves overreacting, we can gently say, my mind is trying to protect me, but maybe it's using the wrong evidence. Because the availability heuristic isn't a flaw, it's a survival tool. It helped our ancestors avoid danger. If they saw someone get sick from a red berry, they remembered it and avoided it forever. It's not a bad system, just an old one. And in our modern world, it sometimes leads us astray. But with awareness, with a little space, we can retrain that reflex. We can remember that what's loud isn't always what's true, that what's unforgettable isn't always what's important. And that truth often lives in the quiet things we overlook. Sometimes the best things aren't easy to remember, because they didn't scare us, or shake us, or shock us. They just helped us, or healed us, or held us steady. So the next time something jumps into your mind, a fear, a headline, a story, ask yourself, did this really happen often, or did it just happen loudly? And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel a little calmer, a little more grounded, a little more in control, because your thoughts don't always have to run the show. You can choose to sit with them, listen kindly, and gently ask them to quiet down. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a simple idea, but one that sneaks into all kinds of places. It's when people who know very little about something believe they know a lot, and people who know a lot often think they don't know enough. It's a curve, confidence rising fast with a little knowledge, then dropping when real understanding begins, and only slowly rising again as wisdom settles in. You've probably seen it before. Someone watches a few videos or reads a headline, and suddenly they're the expert. They have strong opinions, loud certainty, and very little doubt. And on the other side, the real expert is quietly unsure, carefully aware of how complex the topic really is. Because the more you learn, the more you notice what you don't know, and that noticing feels like insecurity. But it's not insecurity, it's humility. And the Dunning-Kruger effect shows us just how rare that is in early learning. It's why beginners can feel so confident, and why true mastery is often soft-spoken. Our brains are wired this way. They fill in gaps, they make quick judgments, and when we learn just a little, our mind says, "I've got this," because it feels good to understand something. Even a little piece feels like a lot. It's like standing at the foot of a mountain, thinking the peak is just one hill away, because you haven't seen the twists and cliffs and valleys ahead. In a world full of information, we confuse access with expertise. We can Google anything, but Googling isn't the same as grasping, not deeply. This effect shows up in arguments, when someone who's barely touched a subject debates with someone who's spent years studying it. And yet, the louder voice is often the one with less knowledge, because confidence is persuasive, and doubt, even healthy doubt, can sound like weakness. But we need that doubt. We need people to say, "It's more complicated than that. There's more to the story. I'm still learning." Those voices matter, but they don't always win the spotlight. And that's where the Dunning-Kruger effect becomes dangerous, not just for individuals, but for decisions, for leadership, for truth. When we reward loud certainty over quiet thoughtfulness, we risk giving the mic to the wrong voice. And it happens in classrooms, where students who guess loudly get more attention, even when they're wrong. It happens in boardrooms, where overconfidence can lead to big mistakes, because no one stops to ask, "Do we really know what we're doing?" And it happens inside us too. We all have areas where we're the beginner pretending to be the expert, because pretending feels safer than admitting uncertainty. And we all have places where we know more than we think, but we're quiet because we've learned to doubt ourselves. It's like learning to cook. You make one good dish, and you feel like a chef, but then you try something new, and it doesn't turn out right, and suddenly, you're not sure anymore. But that moment, where you start to question, that's where the real learning starts. The dip in confidence isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign that you're finally seeing the big picture. So what do we do with that? We pause, we notice, we ask, am I overestimating my understanding, or underestimating it? We can check ourselves gently. We can say, maybe I know a little, and maybe there's still more to see. Because humility doesn't mean you know nothing. It just means you've stopped pretending you know everything. We can build that voice in ourselves, and teach it to others. We can praise curiosity over confidence, and questions over answers. We can create spaces where people feel safe to say, "I don't know," and still be respected. Because that's what makes learning real. Not pretending, not performing, but staying open. We can learn to ask better questions. Not just, "Am I right?" but "What am I missing?" We can listen more, especially to people who have experience, who've lived it, who've studied it. And we can remember that quiet doesn't mean unsure, and loud doesn't mean right. Because the wisest people often hesitate, not because they don't know, but because they know how much there still is to know. So when we see someone speak with big confidence, we can ask, is this grounded in depth, or just in a little bit of knowledge? And when we find ourselves getting loud, we can check in, am I being clear, or just being certain? Because certainty can be comforting, but truth is often complicated. And when we respect that, we grow. We climb that curve, past the first burst of "I get it," into the slower stretch of "maybe I don't," and then into something stronger. And that is where real understanding lives, not at the top of the loud hill, but in the slow, steady climb through humility. The sunk cost fallacy is the mind's way of saying, "But I've already put so much into this." It's the feeling you get when you know something isn't working, but you keep going anyway because stopping feels like giving up. But really, you're holding on to something that's already gone. A sunk cost is anything you've already spent. time, money, effort, or attention. And the fallacy is thinking those past investments should decide what you do next. But they shouldn't. Only the future should decide that. Consider this: you're halfway through a movie, and you're bored. You don't like the plot, you don't care about the characters, but you keep watching because you already watched the first hour. That's sunk cost thinking. Or you order food and it's bad, but you finish it because you paid for it. That's sunk cost thinking too. We tell ourselves, don't waste it. But what we forget is that the waste already happened when we paid, or committed, or started. Continuing won't undo that, but stopping might protect us from losing more. This shows up in relationships when someone stays, not because they're happy, but because they've been together for years. They think about the time they've invested, the memories, the history, and they say, I can't walk away now. But maybe walking away is the only thing that leads to peace. This shows up in careers when someone sticks with a job they hate because they spent years getting the degree. They trained, they climbed, they sacrificed. But if the job makes them miserable, those sunk years shouldn't be the reason to keep going, because staying just adds more years to the pile. We all do this. We stay on paths because we once chose them, and now we feel like we owe it to our past self to see it through. But what if the most loving thing you could do for your past self is to change direction? To say, thank you for trying, thank you for starting, but I'm going a different way now. The sunk cost fallacy makes us confuse commitment with purpose, but commitment without peace becomes a burden, and purpose is allowed to change. It's okay to quit the book halfway. It's okay to leave the movie, to walk out of the meeting, to end the project, to move on from the thing you thought you needed to finish. Finishing isn't always the win. Sometimes letting go is, but it doesn't feel that way because letting go comes with grief. You grieve the version of you who believed this was the right path. You grieve the time you gave, the plans you made, the dreams that didn't happen. But grief is not failure. It's just honesty. And honesty is how you heal. This fallacy can creep into your habits too. Staying with a hobby that drains you, holding on to clutter because you once thought you'd use it, keeping a goal alive even when it no longer fits who you are. You start to realize you're not living in the present. You're living in the shadow of a decision you made years ago. But you are not that version of yourself anymore. You've grown, you've learned, you've changed, and with change comes permission to choose again. So how do we break free from sunk cost thinking? We start by asking better questions. Not, what have I already put in? But what do I still want to get out of this? Not, how much have I spent? But is this still worth continuing? You can pause and say, even if I hadn't already started, would I choose this now? If the answer is no, then it's okay to stop. You're not weak for quitting. You're wise for recognizing when enough is enough. This fallacy lives in tiny moments too. When we keep scrolling through a boring article because we already read the first half. When we keep holding on to that sweater we never wear because it cost a lot. When we say yes to something we no longer believe in just because we once said yes. It's all the same pattern. Past effort shaping future decisions, even when it hurts. But you're allowed to reset. You're allowed to say, what mattered then doesn't have to matter now. You can love your past and still leave it behind. You can thank the path and still turn around. You can look at something you spent years on and still say, I'm choosing something new, because holding on just to honor what's already gone keeps you from building what could still be. And every time you let go, you're telling yourself, I am not a prisoner of my previous choices. I am a student of them. And that mindset opens doors. It frees up your time, your energy, your hope. So next time you feel stuck, ask yourself, am I continuing because I want to, or because I once did? And remember, you owe nothing to a decision that no longer serves you. Not your time, not your peace, not your future. The sunk cost is gone. Let it stay where it is, because life isn't about how much you've put in. It's about what you're still becoming. Hindsight bias is the quiet voice in your head that whispers, you should have seen that coming. It's the feeling you get after something happens, when the outcome feels obvious, like it was always going to happen that way. But it wasn't obvious before, you just didn't know yet. Hindsight bias changes the way we remember the past. It edits the story to make it feel cleaner, more predictable, and less uncertain than it really was. That can be comforting, but also misleading, because the truth is, life is full of unknowns. Most of the time, we're doing the best we can with what we know at the time, but hindsight bias makes it feel like we should have known more, seen the signs, connected the dots, and made the right call. When we start believing that, we become unfair to our past self. It happens in relationships. After a breakup, you look back and think, of course it wasn't going to work. You focus on every red flag and every missed signal. But in the moment, those things didn't look red. They looked normal. They looked like love trying to grow. It happens in jobs too. You leave a role that made you unhappy and say, I knew from the beginning. But you didn't, not really. You had hopes. You had reasons. You were trying. Hindsight bias makes the path behind us look straighter than it was. It makes it feel like we were always heading here, even when we weren't. It smooths the edges, removes the doubts, and rewrites the in-betweens. But growth is not a straight line. It's full of maybes, pauses, and honest mistakes. Hindsight bias doesn't just affect memory. It also affects how we judge others. When something goes wrong, we look at the people involved and say, they should have known better. How could they not see that coming? But from where they stood, it wasn't so clear. We forget how hard it is to make decisions in the dark. Hindsight makes everything brighter, but only after the lights are on. Sometimes, it makes us harder on ourselves than we need to be. We replay a bad decision and tell ourselves, you knew this was a mistake, but maybe we didn't. Maybe we only know now because we've seen how the story ends. But the story hadn't ended yet when we made that choice, and that matters. Because understanding that allows us to forgive ourselves and others. It gives space for compassion, for uncertainty, and for learning. We are not the all-knowing narrators of our own lives. We are characters, figuring it out page by page. When we pretend we should have known everything, we lose the softness, we lose the grace, we become judges instead of witnesses, critics instead of caretakers. We forget that learning takes time, and that clarity often comes after confusion. Hindsight bias shows up in history too. We look at big events and think, it was bound to happen, but that's not how history works. It's messy. It's full of moments that could have gone a dozen different ways. Only one path actually unfolded. And once it does, it feels like it was always going to. But that's just the illusion of looking back. This bias doesn't just show up in the big things. It's there in little things too, like when you forget your umbrella, and then it rains. Your brain says, you knew it was going to rain, even if you didn't check the forecast. Or when you say something and someone gets upset, you think, of course that was going to hurt them. But at the time, you weren't so sure. Hindsight bias makes the past look obvious, but the future never is. So what do we do with this? How do we soften that inner critic that keeps saying, you should have known? We remind ourselves what we actually knew at the time. We remember what information we had, what pressures we felt, and what fears were present. We talk to our past self and say, you did your best with what you had, and that's enough. We stop rewriting the past to make ourselves look careless, or blind, or foolish. Instead, we write it like it really was, uncertain, complex, human. We give ourselves permission to grow in real time, not in reverse. And we practice the same with others. When someone makes a choice and it doesn't go well, we try not to say, they should have known. Instead, we say, maybe they didn't. Maybe they were learning. Because we all are. And that makes space for grace. So next time your mind says, you knew better, pause. Ask yourself, did I? Or am I just seeing clearly now, because I've walked through it? The view from hindsight is always clearer, but clarity after the fact is not the same as foresight. We shouldn't confuse the two. What matters isn't whether you saw it coming. What matters is what you do with what you see now, and how gently you treat the person you used to be. The gambler's fallacy is a little trick the brain plays. It tries to make randomness feel fair. It's the belief that if something happens more often than normal in the short term, then it's less likely to happen again soon. Or the other way around. Like if a coin lands on heads 5 times in a row, we start to think, okay, tails has to be next. But it doesn't. Each flip is its own flip. It's unconnected and unaware of the flips before it. But our brains don't like that. We like patterns. We like balance. We want the world to even itself out. So when we see streaks, We assume they can't keep going even when they can. This fallacy got its name from gamblers. They would bet big because they thought a loss streak meant a win was due. They'd watch red hit 5 times at the roulette table and put everything on black, because it's time. But the wheel doesn't know that. It's not keeping score. It's not trying to be fair. The odds haven't changed. But the human belief gets stronger with every spin. We all do this, not just in casinos, but in daily life. We say things like, "I've had so much bad luck lately. Something good has to happen soon." But luck doesn't work like that. There's no law of balance. No hidden rhythm guarantees fairness. The gambler's fallacy is just our mind trying to control what it can't predict. It shows up in sports when someone's due for a goal or due for a win, as if time itself is keeping track. It shows up in dating when someone has had a string of bad relationships and says, "This next one has to be the right one." But life doesn't work in turns. It works in chances, and each chance stands alone. This fallacy shows up in parenting too. When a child has had a few rough days in a row, we find ourselves thinking, "Tomorrow has to be better." But kids don't reset like clocks. They just keep going. And yet we want things to feel even, because that feels fair. And fair feels safe. But randomness isn't always fair. Sometimes the dice roll the same number again and again, not because it means anything, but because that's how chance works. And when we forget that, we make bad bets, not just with money, but with time and emotion. We stay in situations because we think the tide has to turn. We hold on because we're due, but being due isn't real. This fallacy can keep us stuck, because we think we're just one moment away from the change we want. Sometimes that hope can lead us to wait too long, or give too much, or keep trying something that isn't actually working. We think if we just stay a little longer things will finally shift. But not all things shift, not just because they've been bad for a while. This shows up in work too. Someone might say, "I've had 5 bad interviews in a row, I'm due for a good one." And maybe they are, but the outcome won't depend on how many rejections came before it. It will depend on preparation, timing, and sometimes just plain luck. This idea shows up in our self-esteem too. We might think, "I've been feeling down for so long, I must be about to feel better." And while hope is important, it's also okay to acknowledge that healing doesn't happen on a schedule. Joy doesn't follow pain just to balance things out. Sometimes the storm lingers. That doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It just means life isn't operating on some hidden emotional ledger. So how do we deal with this fallacy? We start by accepting that randomness is real. Life doesn't always make patterns. Fairness is something we create in how we treat people, not something the world owes us. We remember that each decision, each outcome, each moment stands on its own. We pause and ask, am I expecting a reward because of what came before, or because I truly believe this next step makes sense? We can hold hope without letting it become a bet. We can take chances without expecting them to even out. And we can forgive ourselves for wanting things to balance, because that desire comes from a good place, a longing for justice, for peace, for things to make sense. But peace doesn't come from gambling with our time or our trust. Peace comes from presence. It comes from being here, not dragging old spins into new choices. So next time your mind says, "This has happened too many times, the next one has to be different," breathe and say, "This next one will be what it is, and I will meet it as clearly as I can, not because of what came before, but because of who I am now." And that is always enough. The appeal to authority is when we believe something is true, just because someone in power said it, not because we understand it, or check the facts, but because the person saying it seems important. It's an easy shortcut. The brain says, "They know more than me, so I'll trust them." And sometimes, that's okay. We all rely on people with more knowledge or experience. We trust doctors with our health. We trust pilots with our safety. We trust teachers with our learning. But trust shouldn't be automatic, and authority shouldn't be the only reason. Because even smart people can be wrong. And even experts have blind spots. The appeal to authority becomes a fallacy when we stop asking questions, when we stop thinking for ourselves, when we hear a statement and say, "Well, they said it, so it must be true," without checking the logic, or the evidence, or the motive. This happens in politics, when people follow a leader, not because of their ideas, but because of their title. They trust the name, instead of the reasoning. It happens in business, when a CEO makes a decision, and no one questions it, because they're the CEO. But authority doesn't guarantee wisdom, and confidence is not the same as correctness. Sometimes, people in power are just loud, or charismatic, or convincing, and that can feel like truth, but it isn't. This fallacy shows up in families, when a parent says, "Because I said so," and the child isn't allowed to understand the why, or in classrooms, when students memorize facts without learning how to think. When we follow without understanding, we lose something. We lose the habit of asking, "Does this make sense to me?" And that habit is important, because not all authority is earned, and not all experts are objective. Sometimes, authority is just confidence, wrapped in credentials, and sometimes, it's tradition, or culture, or power dynamics that silence disagreement. The appeal to authority can be dangerous when it keeps us from noticing the cracks, when it stops us from saying, "Wait, but why?" And we've seen the harm it can do in history, when scientists were silenced because their views didn't match the official story, when doctors followed orders that went against ethics, because the person giving the orders was in charge, when entire populations were taught things just because those in power said it was true. This fallacy isn't just about others, it happens inside us too. Sometimes we trust someone's voice over our own intuition. We ignore our instincts, because someone with a badge, or a degree, or a title, said otherwise, and slowly, we forget to think independently. We lose the voice inside that says, "Let me pause, let me explore, let me ask more." But questioning isn't the same as disrespect. You can honor someone's experience, while still thinking critically. You can trust and verify at the same time. So how do we avoid falling into this? We practice curiosity. We learn to separate the person from the point. We ask ourselves, would this argument make sense if someone else said it? We look for evidence, not just reputation. We say, "Show me how you know, not just who you are." We remember that titles don't make ideas true, and truth doesn't need to shout. And when we feel pressured to agree, because someone important said it, we can slow down. We can ask, "Do I understand this, or am I just trusting the name?" And that question alone can bring clarity. Authority should invite us to learn, not to follow blindly. And real experts welcome questions. They don't just demand belief. So next time someone says, "Trust me, I'm an expert," listen. But also ask, what are they saying? Why do they believe it? Can they explain it simply? Does it match what I see and know? Because the most trustworthy voices aren't just smart, they're open. They don't just speak, they help others understand. And in that space, you're allowed to think for yourself, to explore, to challenge, to learn, not because you doubt everyone, but because you value your mind, and you're willing to keep it awake. The false cause fallacy is when the brain connects two events. It assumes one caused the other just because they happen close together. It's that simple. And that's sneaky. It's like saying, "I wore my lucky socks and we won the game. So the socks must be the reason." Or, "I ate soup, and then I felt better. So the soup healed me." Maybe it did. Maybe it helped. But maybe it didn't. Because correlation is not causation. Things can happen near each other without one causing the other. But our minds are built for stories, and stories need causes. So we find them, even if they're not really there. This fallacy shows up all over life, in small things and serious things. We blame people. We blame moments. We blame weather. We blame timing. We say, "Ever since I moved here, things have gone wrong." Or, "After I started that job, my back pain got worse." But was it the job? Or just time passing? Or something else entirely? This fallacy loves patterns, and patterns love meaning. So when something happens, our mind starts looking for what came before, and picks the closest match. But the closest match isn't always the real reason. Imagine this: a child starts struggling in school. The parent says, "Ever since she started hanging out with that friend, her grades have dropped." Maybe that's true, but maybe she's dealing with anxiety. Or maybe the schoolwork just got harder. Or maybe she needs glasses. We jump to the nearest cause because it feels like an answer. And answers feel safe. But false causes can lead us down the wrong path. We treat the wrong thing. We blame the wrong person. We make choices based on illusions. This happens in health all the time. Someone eats a new food and gets sick that night. So they swear off that food forever. Maybe it really was the cause. Or maybe it was stress. Or timing. Or something else entirely. And in relationships, this fallacy can become a habit. We think, the fight started right after they got home from work, so work must be the reason. But maybe the argument was building for days. Maybe the tension was already there. Maybe the timing was just a coincidence. False cause thinking can create fear where there shouldn't be fear, and blame where there shouldn't be blame. And once we believe the wrong cause, it's hard to unsee it. We start collecting evidence to support that link, and ignore everything else. We say, every time I talk to her something bad happens. Or whenever I try something new, I fail. Not because it's true, but because the story feels familiar, and familiarity feels like truth. This happens in parenting too. A child cries after eating broccoli, and now we avoid broccoli forever. But maybe they were tired, maybe they were overstimulated, or maybe it had nothing to do with food at all. We do this in friendships when we say, the last 3 times we talked, I felt drained. So maybe they're toxic, but maybe it's not them. Maybe it's the season you're in. Maybe it's what you brought into the conversation. We confuse what happened with why it happened. Because the why is harder to know, and the closest story is often the one we settle for. But settling can lead us away from the truth. So what do? How do we stop the story when it's moving too fast? We slow it down. We pause between events and ask, could this be a coincidence? Is there another explanation? What else could be going on here? We give ourselves room to explore other reasons, to see the bigger picture. We remember that life is full of moving parts, and one thing rarely causes another all by itself. We learn to hold space for uncertainty, for complexity. We can say, I don't know for sure, but I'm curious. And that curiosity can keep us from closing the case too early. We can train our minds to look beyond the obvious, to challenge the easy explanations, and ask harder questions. Like, what data am I not seeing? Am I confusing proximity with cause? Does this pattern actually repeat, or does it just feel that way? False cause fallacies aren't about being silly or irrational. They're about being human. They're about how badly we want for the world to make sense, even when it doesn't, because we want comfort, and connection, and reasons. But sometimes the world just moves in mysterious, messy, overlapping ways. And sometimes, things just happen next to each other. Not because of each other. And that's okay. We can still make meaning without needing every moment to have a clear cause. We can still learn without blaming the wrong thing. And we can still grow without knowing all the reasons why. So next time your mind says, this happened so that must have caused it, take a breath, ask a few more questions, and look again. Because truth is rarely that simple. But it's always worth finding. Ad hominem means to the person. And the ad hominem fallacy is when we attack the person instead of the argument. When we say, you're wrong because of who you are, instead of, you're wrong because of what you said. It's when the brain skips the point and goes for the person. And it feels powerful because it's personal. We don't like what they believe, so we question their character. We don't agree with their view, so we tear down their voice. But attacking the speaker doesn't make the message untrue. And defending your idea should never require harming someone else. This fallacy shows up all the time. In debates, in politics, in conversations online. We hear, you can't trust him, he's just a dropout. Or she's only saying that because she's emotional. As if education or emotion erase the truth in their words. As if the source is the only thing that matters. But truth isn't about who says it. It's about what's being said. A good idea can come from someone flawed. And a bad idea can come from someone we admire. Attacking the person is easier than engaging with the thought. Because thoughts require work. They require listening and patience and focus. But people, we can judge them in seconds, based on one detail or one mistake. We say, oh, he cheated once, so nothing he says matters. Or she's rich, so of course she would think that. And just like that, we close the door. But when we do that, we don't just lose the argument. We lose the chance to understand. This fallacy lives in us quietly, in the way we dismiss someone because they're young or old or different. We stop hearing as soon as we label. We say, "What would she know? She's just a kid," or "He's too privileged to understand." And sometimes those things shape perspective, but they don't erase reasoning. We can disagree with someone without discrediting who they are. We can challenge their ideas without attacking their character. This fallacy also shows up in ourselves. When we hear a truth, and instead of sitting with it, we go after the messenger. We say, "He doesn't get to tell me that, he's not perfect either." And maybe he's not. But the message still might matter, because sometimes we'd rather defend our ego than open our mind. But growth requires vulnerability. It means accepting that someone we don't like might still have something valuable to say, and that someone we love might not always be right. It happens in friendships. When someone gives us feedback and instead of hearing it, we start digging through their flaws. You do the same thing. You're not one to talk, and in that moment we're not protecting truth, we're protecting pride. This fallacy also shows up when we're hurt. Someone says something that stings, and instead of looking at the words, we look at them, their past, their worst moments, and we say, "Nope, not listening." But sometimes the truth is carried by people we don't want to hear from, and that's what makes it hard, because when we see someone's faults, we want to throw out everything else. But people are not all or nothing, and neither are ideas. You can learn from someone without endorsing everything they are. You can take the insight without signing off on the person. This isn't about trusting everyone. It's about listening without weaponizing identity. It's about choosing to ask, what if there's something valuable here, even if it's coming from someone I don't like? It's about realizing that truth isn't loyal to our preferences. So how do we avoid this? How do we keep the focus on the point and not the person? We start by asking, am I reacting to who they are or to what they're saying? We pause, we breathe. We slow the instinct to strike. We say, let me listen to the thought, not just the tone. We can remind ourselves that flaws don't cancel out facts, and that character isn't the same as content. We can ask, if someone else said this, would I hear it differently? And if the answer is yes, then maybe we're reacting to the name, not the meaning. We also stay open to the idea that wisdom doesn't always look like we expect. It can wear a hoodie, or a robe, or tattoos, or silence. And if we only trust what's dressed like us, we might miss what really matters. And when we feel that urge to defend by discrediting, to protect ourselves by pointing fingers, we can breathe and ask, what's really being said here? What's underneath the feeling? Because often we're not reacting to the words, we're reacting to the fear of being wrong, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of changing. But fear isn't a reason to attack, it's a reason to slow down, because people are not their worst moments, and truth is not always dressed in the clothes we prefer. So next time someone says something you don't like, pause, ask yourself, am I rejecting this because of who they are, or because of what they're saying? And in that moment you create space for clarity, space for honesty, space for truth to stand on its own 2 feet, without needing a name to carry it. The slippery slope fallacy is when we believe that one small step will lead to something big and terrible. It's the fear that if we let this happen, then that will happen, and then everything will fall apart. It usually starts small, with a decision, an idea, a change. But instead of seeing it for what it is, we imagine it spiraling out of control. Like, if we allow this rule, then eventually all our freedoms will be gone. Or if we let this person in, soon we'll be overrun. Or if I take a day off, I'll become lazy and never work again. And suddenly, the mind isn't responding to what's in front of us. It's responding to the worst case scenario it just built out of fear. Because fear loves momentum. It takes a small concern and stretches it into a catastrophe. It's a voice in your head that doesn't say what's likely to happen. It says what's the scariest thing that could happen. And the brain listens, because the brain wants to keep you safe. So instead of taking the next step, we freeze, or we run, or we fight the step like it's already the mountain. This fallacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up in quiet ways. We say, if I open up, they'll leave me. Or if I make a mistake, I'll lose everything. And we don't stop to ask if that's really true. We just believe that one thing leads to another leads to disaster. But most of the time, that's not how life works. Most changes are not instant avalanches. They're moments, followed by more moments, and we get to choose how we respond at each step. The slippery slope fallacy tries to take that choice away. It tells us, once you start, you can't stop, but you can. You can pause, you can pivot, you can learn. We are not sleds on a hill. We are humans with brakes, and steering, and the ability to say, this far and no further. This fallacy shows up in arguments. When people say, if we change this one policy, then everything will collapse. But the world doesn't usually fall apart because of one decision. And fear is not a forecast. This fallacy shows up in parenting too. When we say, if I let my kids skip one homework, they'll become irresponsible forever. But learning isn't a straight line, and trust isn't that fragile. It happens in relationships. When we think, if I show weakness, they'll lose respect for me, and then they'll leave, and then I'll be alone forever. But vulnerability doesn't always lead to loss, and opening up can build closeness, not just risk it. So how do we catch this fallacy? How do we stop the slide before it turns into a panic? We start by asking, am I responding to this moment, or to a chain of imagined moments? We separate the now from the next. We say, what's actually happening, not what might happen next week or next year. We challenge the story our fear is trying to write, and we write a new one. One that says, this is one step, not the whole staircase, and I can make decisions without predicting doom. We can remind ourselves that change doesn't have to be dangerous, and not every beginning is a disaster waiting to unfold. We can ask ourselves, what's the next small choice that keeps me grounded? Not the big dramatic future, but the one thing that feels clear right now. Because life isn't a slope, it's a path, and it turns when we turn. It slows when we slow, and sometimes, what looks like a slide is just the beginning of something better, if we stop assuming the worst and stay present with the real. The appeal to ignorance is when we say something must be true just because it hasn't been proven false, or we say something must be false because it hasn't been proven true. It's the idea that if we don't have proof against it, then it must be right, or wrong, by default. But that's not how truth works. Lack of evidence is not the same as evidence of lack. Just because we haven't seen it, doesn't mean it isn't there. And just because no one's proven it doesn't mean it's false. This fallacy lives in the quiet spaces, the in-betweens, the unknowns, and our minds don't like unknowns. We want answers, even if they're shaky. We want closure, even if it's incomplete. So when there's a gap in knowledge, our brain fills it in with what feels safe, or familiar, or simple. We say things like, no one's proven it exists, so it must not be real. Or, no one's shown that it doesn't work, so it must be effective. But reality doesn't bend to the limits of our knowledge. Truth exists, whether we've proven it or not. This fallacy shows up in arguments when people say, you can't prove me wrong, so I must be right. But truth isn't measured by how easy it is to disprove. It's measured by how well it's supported, by reason and evidence. This fallacy can also sound like, well, no one knows for sure, so anything is possible. But anything is possible isn't the same as anything is likely. Possibility is not a substitute for logic, and ignorance is not a substitute for proof. This shows up in everyday life too. Like when someone says, no one has proven this food is unhealthy, so it must be fine. Or, we don't have all the data, so let's assume it's safe. But the absence of data doesn't make a thing safe, or dangerous, or true, or false. It just means we don't know yet. And we don't know is a valid answer. In fact, it's often the most honest one. This fallacy shows up in history, when people dismissed ideas just because they hadn't been proven yet. Like when they said, there's no proof germs exist, so they must not be real. Or, we've never seen something like that, so it must be impossible. But then someone looked deeper, asked more questions, and found a truth that was always there, just waiting to be seen. This fallacy also shows up in relationships. We say they haven't said anything nice lately, so they must not care anymore. Or they haven't explained themselves, so they must be hiding something. But silence is not always meaning, and not hearing something doesn't prove anything yet. Sometimes, people just don't know how to express themselves, or they're still figuring things out, or they're waiting for the right moment. And our assumptions aren't facts. This fallacy also shows up in our inner life. When we try something new and it doesn't work right away, we think, I guess this isn't for me, or I must not be good at this. But just because success hasn't shown up yet, doesn't mean it won't. Not knowing the outcome doesn't mean the outcome is bad, and uncertainty is not a sign to give up. It's just a pause, a breath, a space where something might still grow. So how do we catch this fallacy? How do we stay open without falling into wishful thinking? We learn to hold space for the unknown without rushing to fill it. We say, I don't know, and that's okay. We remind ourselves that not knowing is not weakness. It's honesty, and honesty leads to better thinking. We practice saying, just because I haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not real. And also, just because it hasn't been disproven doesn't mean it's true. We look for reasons, not just gaps. We look for patterns, not just guesses. We can ask, what evidence is there for this? What do we know? What do we still need to find out? We train our minds to stay curious instead of jumping to conclusions. And when someone says, you can't prove me wrong, we can say, you're right, but that doesn't prove you right either. We step back and see the whole picture, not just the empty spaces, and we let our beliefs rest on what we know, not on what we don't, because knowledge is not built on silence. It's built on substance. We can live with the unknown without needing to make it into something just to feel safe, because safety doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from being at peace with asking better questions. So next time you hear something that's built only on the idea that no one can prove otherwise, pause and ask, is that really evidence, or is that just the absence of it? Because truth doesn't live in what's missing. It lives in what's been found, what's been tested, what holds up even when it's questioned. And when we can say, we don't know yet, with calm, with humility, with curiosity, then we're not falling behind. We're thinking clearly. The strawman fallacy is when someone takes what you said, twists it, and then argues against that version instead of what you actually meant. It's not always loud, not always cruel, but it is dishonest. Because instead of hearing you fully, they create a weaker version of your idea and tear that down instead. Like if you say, I think we should spend less on the military, and someone replies, so you just want the country to be defenseless? Or you say, I believe in stricter environmental laws, and they say, oh, so you want everyone to live in the dark without power? What you said and what they heard are not the same. And now you're defending a point you didn't even make. That's the heart of the strawman fallacy. Replacing someone's real position with an easier target, a version that sounds extreme, or unreasonable, or wrong, and then attacking that instead. It's easier than listening, easier than engaging, because real ideas take effort and nuance. But a strawman, you can knock down in one punch. It's like building a fake opponent out of paper and pretending you've won a real fight. This fallacy shows up all the time. In arguments, in debates, in relationships. It shows up when we stop listening and start assuming. Someone says, I'm tired, and we say, oh, so you hate your life now? They say, I need space, and we say, so you're leaving me. They say, I wish you'd be more present, and we say, so now I'm a failure. That's not listening. That's defending a version that never existed. And it hurts, because it makes people feel unseen. This fallacy doesn't just block understanding. It builds walls. It creates distance where there could be clarity. It shows up in politics, all the time. Someone offers a small change, and it's twisted into something radical. Someone expresses a concern, and it's reframed as hate. And suddenly, there's no room for real conversation, just noise. The strawman fallacy is not just unfair, it's lazy thinking, because it avoids the truth in favor of control. So how do we catch it? How do we stop ourselves from building paper people and setting them on fire? We slow down. We listen to what's actually being said, not what we fear is being said, not what we expect to hear, not what would make them easier to argue with, but the real thing, the full sentence, the actual thought. And when we don't understand, we ask. We say, can you say that again? Or I want to make sure I understand you correctly. We make space for clarity before we respond. And when someone does it to us, when they twist our words, we can gently bring it back. We say, that's not what I said. Or let me explain what I really meant. not to win, but to reconnect. Because communication is not a competition, it's a relationship, and relationships need truth, not straw. So next time you hear something and your brain starts reacting, pause, ask, is this what they really said, or just what it sounded like in my head? That one pause can be everything, because most misunderstandings aren't about the words, they're about the way we hold them. And most arguments aren't about the core, they're about the edges, the places where things got blurry. So let's unblur them. Let's trade straw for substance, and blame for curiosity. Let's listen deeper, speak slower, and keep reaching for what's real. Confirmation bias is a quiet kind of a thinking trap. It doesn't shout, it doesn't slam doors, it just gently pushes you toward what you already believe, and it makes the other side feel less real. When we talk about confirmation bias, we're talking about a brain that wants comfort. It wants things to match. It wants the world to agree with the story it already knows. That's not because we're lazy. It's because the brain craves order. Chaos is stressful, and when we hear or see something that goes against what we believe, it feels like a threat, not a big one, but just enough to make us pull away. You see this when people read the news. If someone believes a certain idea about the world, they'll keep finding sources that agree with that idea, and without realizing it, they'll start living inside a bubble of agreement. It's like building a house out of yeses. Every article, every post, every video, just another brick in the wall, until eventually, they stop noticing the no's. They stop letting anything in that doesn't fit the pattern. And this happens to all of us, not just some people, not just the ones we disagree with. You, me, everyone, we all have this tendency. Even scientists, who are trained to question things, can fall into confirmation bias. They might have a favorite theory, and so they might see data that supports it more clearly, and ignore data that doesn't fit. It's not on purpose. It's the mind trying to make everything make sense. And when it comes to relationships, confirmation bias can be tricky. If we think someone is selfish, we start noticing every little thing they do that seems selfish. We ignore the moments they're kind, not because we're mean, but because our brain is saying, see, I told you they were like that. Over time, it becomes harder to change our minds, because our minds have been collecting evidence. And even if the evidence is one-sided, it still feels like truth. But here's the thing, truth doesn't always feel comfortable. Sometimes, real truth asks us to stretch, to say, maybe I was wrong, and that's hard. Confirmation bias makes that even harder, because it's protecting us from the discomfort of doubt. And in groups like political groups or social movements, this bias can build walls. Each side gathers its own facts, its own experts. Each side becomes convinced the other is misinformed, and dialogue stops, because everyone is listening to their own echo. Algorithms don't help either. On social media, we're fed content we already agree with, because that's what keeps us watching. But that also deepens the bias. It makes it feel like everyone thinks this way, when in reality, we're just seeing a reflection. It's like standing in a hall of mirrors, and thinking it's the whole world. Confirmation bias also shows up in small ways. Let's say you think you're not good at math. Then every time you mess up a calculation, you remember it. And every time you do something right, you brush it off. You say it was just luck. The mind becomes a filter, keeping the stories we already believe, and letting the rest slip through the cracks. This is why self-perception can be so hard to change, and why we hold on to judgments of others, why apologies feel rare, and why arguments on the internet go in circles. But what if we treated beliefs like drafts, not final versions? What if we asked, what would it take to change my mind, and actually meant it? Sometimes, just noticing that we're doing it is enough to loosen the grip. You could try this exercise. Pick a belief you're really sure about, then try to argue against it, not because you want to lose it, but because you want to understand it better, because you want to see if it holds up, or better yet, have a calm conversation with someone who disagrees with you, not to win, just to listen, and maybe see what they're seeing. We're not computers. We don't process facts in clean lines. We're stories, memories, feelings, experiences. Confirmation bias is what happens when those stories take the wheel. But it's okay. You're allowed to believe something and still be open to being wrong. That's where growth lives, right on the edge of certainty. Right where the mind says, wait, maybe. Confirmation bias doesn't make you broken. It just means you're built like everyone else, with a brain that's trying to protect you, even when it gets in the way. And when you realize that, you can pause. You can take a breath and say, I don't have to be right now. I just want to understand. And maybe that's enough to shift something, even just a little.